It feels like a really important part of shopping that when you buy something, you actually want to know how much it'll cost before you pay for it. But I know that when I'm travelling abroad, it's not always clear to me. I have to think about not only the exchange rate, but also if there are going to be other fees that are charged without me knowing about it. Can dynamic currency conversion help? Should people be confident or worried about using it? And what benefits can it bring for merchants? Let's find out in this episode of Navigating Digital Payments.
Welcome to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline, bringing you the latest innovations, trends, and predictions about the future of payments.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Navigating Digital Payments podcast. I'm David Daly. I look after the Discovery Hub here at Worldline, and today I'm really thrilled to be joined by someone who can shed a lot of light on this topic of dynamic currency conversion. He is Hugh McCarthy, Business Development Manager for e-commerce at Worldline. Hi Hugh, welcome to the podcast.
Hi David, delighted to be part of your podcast series, which I'm really enjoying, I must say. A quick shout out to all your listeners. Great to be able to join you here today to discuss dynamic currency conversion. Highly recommend your listeners go back and listen to some of the early episodes of Navigating Digital Payments, which I have to say I found really entertaining. So really looking forward to this session, David.
Brilliant to have you on board. And it's always especially nice, I think, when we have a listener becoming a guest on the podcast. So really fantastic to have you here. So I guess in this episode, what I would really like to understand from you is what benefits dynamic currency conversion can bring, not just to consumers, but also to the sellers, to the merchants. And also I'd like to unpick maybe a few of the concerns that people might have around dynamic currency conversion. Then I think also at the end, it would be good to talk a bit about, are there certain types of merchants or categories of merchants that this is more relevant for? And also what feedback you have from merchants about this. But before we come on to all of that, maybe I can ask you to explain in very simple terms for people who perhaps have never heard of this topic before, what we mean when we talk about dynamic currency conversion.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. So I guess just at a very high level, dynamic currency conversion allows you, the cardholder, to pay in your currency when you're abroad. And actually, David, what I thought I would do today is I'd use a recurring theme to try and create a very simple scenario that your listeners might be able to understand. And that's the Eurovision Song Contest, which is taking place in Basel in Switzerland on May the 17th. Now, you're probably asking, David, how do I know so much about the Eurovision, or where does this interest come from? I'm Irish, and being Irish, we have a lot of pride in our results over the last 40 or 50 years in the Eurovision. Along with Sweden, we have won the Eurovision 7 times, which is the highest number of wins for any European country apart from Sweden. Now, like yourselves in the UK, our recent participation in the Eurovision has been, I think, poor at best. We haven't really featured at all. And actually, interestingly enough, the last time Ireland won the Eurovision was 1996, and the last time the UK won the Eurovision was 1997. So I think today, in order to try and just conceptualize dynamic currency conversion for your listeners, you and I are going to actually attend the Eurovision in Basel this year. You, as a UK supporter, will be paying for your transactions with your GBP, your British pound denominated credit card. I'll be using my Swedish kroner card. And maybe just to clear the confusion here, David, I am Irish. I'm living in Sweden. That allows me to actually claim 14 Eurovision wins over the past 40 or 50 years. Which I really enjoy because, like I said, I'm a bit of a Eurovision buff. I'm a big fan. So I think we're going to have a great time in Basel in Switzerland. But what's important to recognize here is that whilst we're in Switzerland, products will be priced in Swiss franc. So dynamic currency conversion in this sense is going to provide you and I with transparency and clarity when we're paying for our goods and our services in Basel for the Eurovision as to what that amount is in our currency. So instantaneously, when we're paying for our goods and services, what will happen is at that point of sale, you, with your British pound card, David, you'll be shown the amount both in Swiss franc and in British pounds. Me as a Swedish cardholder, I'll be showing the amount in Swedish kroner and in Swiss franc as well. And ultimately what DCC is trying to do for that cardholder is create that transparency and that clarity around what that amount is going to be in your home currency. Important to remember with dynamic currency conversion, David, is it's an optional service. I think there is some misconceptions around DCC that it's forced upon cardholders. It's absolutely not. It's optional and it's transparent, and it's going to let you know at that point of sale exactly what that transaction is going to cost in your currency. So at a high level, that's really what dynamic currency conversion is providing for customers when they shop overseas.
Firstly, I love you using the example of the Eurovision Song Contest because it is a big highlight in our annual calendar in our household to sit down and watch all the entries. I think my daughters are now just about an age where they can make it to the end of the voting, which makes it a bit more exciting.
Not if you're from the UK or Ireland, David. But,
yeah, that's true. We're struggling. We've struggled a bit lately, haven't we? And I'm wondering though, are you deliberately moving countries to be able to rack up the largest number of Eurovision Song Contest wins in total? Hugh?
The UK on 5 wins, David, will become an interesting prospect for me if they win this year. So let's keep that book open.
And as you said, though, very simply, and I was thinking we keep calling it dynamic currency conversion to avoid acronyms, but most of the time people are talking about DCC and using the acronym because we love acronyms in payments, of course.
Yes, indeed.
And very simply, it means that when I'm in Switzerland attending the Eurovision Song Contest, the price is presented to me at the point of sale, both in Swiss francs, but also crucially in British pounds. And if I pay with British pounds, then the amount that I'm shown will be the exact amount that is debited from my account.
Correct. And I think important as well, David, to maybe remind listeners that it's not just an in-store service. It's also available in e-commerce environments too as well. So again, for merchants who have high volumes of foreign transactions coming from foreign cardholders, DCC is also a service that can be enabled in an e-commerce environment also. So really, again, where cardholders are interacting with a point of sale, whether that's online or in-store, DCC is a value-added service that merchants can typically activate.
I mean, maybe you've already sort of touched on this a little bit, but from the consumer perspective, what is the real benefit for them versus not having DCC enabled?
Very relevant question, David, and it's one that we will typically get as part of our merchant visits. So when we offer the DCC service, or when merchants offer the DCC service, one of the critical components is that they offer that DCC service to their cardholders in a compliant manner. So DCC, what it is a service that is regulated by the card schemes. So Visa and MasterCard set the rules around DCC and how it interacts from a customer point of view. So what's very important to understand is that what we always have to be is transparent. We also have to ensure that there are no hidden charges. There's nothing hidden within that DCC offer to the cardholder. So I think when we look at what it gives to consumers, it gives price transparency first and foremost. When we talked about our example of attending the Eurovision, you and I know in our home currencies what each transaction is going to cost us there and then. I guess the alternative there is that you do not choose DCC and you let your issuing bank manage that transaction for you. What you typically don't get with your issuing bank managing that transaction there and then is an understanding of what that final amount will be. It will typically take a length of time before you understand exactly what that Rolex has cost you in Basel when you're using retail therapy to drown your sorrows from coming second last or last in the Eurovision to Ireland. So ultimately, that's, I think, the transparency first and foremost is a very, very interesting prospect for customers when they're overseas. It can be quite difficult to navigate when you're in foreign countries. What is this transaction costing me? So we think again about Swiss franc, and I'll come to an example later where I can show you where sometimes people, when they travel, it's quite easy to say, look, British pound to Swiss franc, maybe it's 1 for 1 or close enough. So I'll just take that. When I'm in Switzerland, if something costs 100 Swiss francs, it's going to cost 100 pounds. I can take the same mentality for euro, but that actually has an impact on the final amount. And I'll give you an example of that a little later in the podcast. So apart from the transparency for consumers, I think it also gives them peace of mind, and it's easier to budget when you're overseas. And what we also find with dynamic currency conversion is business travelers tend to like the service because it allows them there and then to input these transactions into their expense reports and get that cleared as quickly as possible. So for business travelers, it's a service that is highly appreciated. And for consumers, the transparency and the visibility is something that they appreciate when they're overseas as well. I think also what's important to highlight with DCC as well is that the rates tend to be quite competitive. And again, I know there are misconceptions that DCC potentially tries to rip customers off. We'd like to dispel that myth completely, particularly within Worldline, because we have what's called a best rate guarantee. So what we're saying is that when you make a purchase and you choose DCC, we're giving you the best rate that's available on that day. And if you purchase something else that day with the same card and don't choose DCC and you get a better rate, we'll actually refund you the difference between the rate that you got when you didn't choose DCC versus the rate that you got when you got DCC. So again, it's all about trying to provide that sense of security for consumers when they're overseas.
So that's really interesting, Hugh. And listening to your answer, it sounds like it all for the consumer boils down to transparency. And part of that is that you're not having to do the calculation in your head to figure out how much the foreign currency will be in your home currency. But also it's that you are being presented with essentially a guaranteed cost, a guaranteed amount that will be debited from your account at the point of sale. So you have absolute certainty in how much something is costing you. In a minute, I would like to understand from you what types of merchants this is particularly relevant for and what feedback you've had. But first, maybe we can go a little bit more deeply into some of the concerns people have. And I think you've started to hint at them a little bit there. So let's start with fees. Should people be worried that, maybe they're presented with a price on the terminal, but they might actually get charged some additional hidden fees after the transaction has taken place?
There are, for the most part, no hidden fees with DCC. And I think what's critical is that cardholders, when they're overseas, pay attention to what is being presented. There's always going to be actors in certain markets that take advantage of the fact that the merchant can actually, in some cases, decide what that fee is going to be to the cardholder. So there have been cases of gouging. I think it's really important that consumers, when they're overseas, are vigilant. And really, if they feel uncomfortable with what's being presented from a DCC perspective, my advice would be don't choose DCC. Choose to pay in the local currency and let your issuing bank manage that transaction and that FX for you. But I think critically here, it's about financial literacy in a sense. It's about cardholders and ourselves when we're in Switzerland. How much of an understanding do we have as to what the exchange rate is, give or take? But also there are additional fees. And I think actually maybe, David, an important point to mention here is that there is probably a misconception as well around if I don't choose DCC, there's no conversion cost. That's absolutely not the case. There's always going to be a conversion cost. If you don't choose DCC, it's your issuing bank that's going to do that conversion for you. And typically they will charge a fee for that conversion too as well. So what DCC is providing, it's providing a competitive offer to what your issuing bank is doing. And I think actually something that goes kind of unnoticed in a sense with dynamic currency conversion as well is because it puts competitive pressure on issuing banks, that actually also brings down the fees that cardholders are charged by their banks when they're overseas. So I think it gets a bad rep, but a lot of the time people maybe don't fully understand what dynamic currency conversion does, both for them as a cardholder, but also that competitive pressure that it can put on issuing banks too as well. And we price it in a way that is competitive. So, I mean, the difficulty we have, and again, when we talk about transparency, if you don't choose DCC, I won't say you don't get transparency, but what you need to be is you need to be incredibly in tune with what the exchange rate on that day is, what fees your bank will charge you, what exchange rate will be applied and when that exchange rate will be applied. So again, there's a big ask on the consumer when they're overseas to have a lot of information. And again, in a point of sale, in-store environment where there's a queue of people behind you, it's not really the time to start taking out your phone, asking ChatGPT for some help here with the currency conversion, etc. So again, dynamic currency conversion gives you what that amount will be. And whether you choose it or not, it's a service that provides international cardholders with peace of mind and comfort when they're traveling overseas.
And I mean, this is just speaking from personal experience. I'm sure I have sometimes been abroad, and at the point of sale, the the sales assistant has said, oh, choose the local currency because that's always cheaper. Are they right? I mean, why would we be getting that message sometimes when we're purchasing abroad?
Yeah, I think it tends to be a stock response at times, and actually part of the work that we do with DCC within Worldline. So our merchants that offer DCC, we have a remit to ensure that they are offering DCC in a compliant manner to their cardholders. And part of that is that they're not steering. So they're not giving the cardholder information which could make them choose one choice over the other. Cardholder choice is at the very core of dynamic currency conversion. So what we would do typically is we will do on-site trainings, off-site trainings with our merchants to ensure that staff understand how to offer DCC in a compliant manner. Critical part of the work that we do. It also gives us fantastic intelligence from our merchants when we're in the field and we're training them on site. We get to talk to them one-on-one. We get to ask them questions around, what do your cardholders think about DCC? Do you get positive feedback, negative feedback? How does it work in practice? Can we do some test transactions? So we're really coming back with a lot of really good insight as to how DCC is performing, where we need to make adjustments, and providing those merchants also with the performance analytics that we have behind dynamic currency conversion too as well. So, where do your cardholders come from? How likely, if they're from the US, is it going to be that they'll choose DCC or not? We can really drill into a quite granular level of data when it comes to dynamic currency conversions, which I think is great for merchants to know, because those insights can prove very, very useful.
That's really interesting. And I think it highlights, it's come up a few times actually on the podcast, that really whenever you change something at the point of sale, typically there has to be some training or education for the staff that are working in that environment, because if there's any issue or any queries, they're the first port of call. So it's really important.
And just to go back to your question as well, for the merchant or the staff working at the merchant site to suggest to a cardholder that it's better for them to pay in the local currency, that would actually require a significant amount of insight from that merchant's staff member. They would need to know what fee your bank is charging you for that transaction. They'd also need to know what the exchange rate that's being applied is, and they don't. So in a sense, it can be a default answer, but it's also not the right answer because you don't have that visibility from a cardholder perspective as to what the underlying fees are for them when they don't choose DCC.
Yeah, I mean, from what you're saying, it's an uninformed answer, meaning they really can't know, as you say, without checking with your bank, what fees you would be charged for a local currency transaction. Another point I did want to ask you about, which is there could be an argument, I think, that in general, we're trying to make payments frictionless, easier. And okay, we're giving with DCC some choice, but it's also an additional step and an additional thinking process that the customer has to go through. So I guess what I'm asking is there a trade-off there? I mean, is it valuable to provide this extra option to consumers in all cases?
Very good question, David. And actually, I'm going to refer to one of your previous podcast episodes to try and answer this with a previous podcast, which I don't think has been done before. But you had a show a number of months back around, I think it was charity donations. Okay, I think it was called Can Roundup Donations Make a Difference? Really, really interesting. Highly recommend your listeners go back and listen. That in itself is adding an additional step at that point of sale, so to speak. Also, what we've seen recently introduced in Sweden is tipping. So, for example, when you're at a restaurant and you've had your meal, what will happen is you'll insert your card and you all of a sudden get options. Do you want to tip 5%, 10%, 15%, another amount, or not tip at all? So I don't think the argument that DCC adds friction really kind of stacks up anymore, because we're happy enough to create additional steps for charity, which I think is a fantastic initiative, by the way. I think it's a really, really good way to get those micropayments into charity. Also for tipping. So for me, the trade-off here is the DCC service a worthwhile service for that merchant's consumers? Does it provide them a peace of mind? Does it provide them with something which creates a level of satisfaction and ease? And what we see is that it does, and the feedback that we get from merchants is that the DCC service is appreciated because of everything we've spoken about already. It gives those foreign cardholders the comfort and security of knowing what the amount is going to cost in their transaction.
And I guess also, Hugh, you mentioned something earlier, almost in passing, which is that it detects, doesn't it, whether the card is a non local card, and therefore for any consumers that are domestic, there's no extra step for them. I assume they're
No,
not going. They won't be presented with an additional option because they're paying in the local currency
that's
by default. So actually, it's the provision is only there when someone is traveling internationally, and as you say, for them, the feedback we're having, it sounds like, is that they appreciate the certainty and the transparency that DCC gives them, and so the very small extra time effort is not proving an issue.
I think modern payment terminals as well, David, we've come a long way in the last 5-10 years. So how we're actually interfacing with those payment terminals, both physically but also online, provides a much more user-friendly use case for dynamic currency conversion. I think it's getting more that you're able to incorporate countries' flags, for example. So again, I think maybe some of the negativity around dynamic currency conversion a number of years ago was that it wasn't a straightforward choice. Yes, I'm being offered the choice, but how do I actually choose DCC or non-DCC? I think we have surpassed that. The latest iterations of DCC and terminals are giving cardholders a really, really user-friendly and, again, transparent and easy to understand choice when it comes to currency conversion.
And just maybe one final question before we move on more to the merchant side and their experience of this. People might have heard, particularly people in the world of payments, might have heard of multi-currency pricing. So can you say a bit about that and how that compares to DCC?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, David. MCP, multi-currency pricing.
Another acronym. Yeah.
We need another 3-letter acronym. And DCC, they typically get mentioned side by side or in the same breath. So really just to maybe break both down into their component parts. Multi-currency pricing, which predominantly is something that's offered in online or e-commerce environments. So there are some use cases for multi-currency pricing in store, but actually it's quite a hands-on process for that merchant. So what the merchant will need to do is have most likely price tags that can change currency, and then at the point of sale, the cardholder needs to be asked what currency they want to pay in. Whereas DCC is instantaneous. There's no question that needs to be asked because the terminal will recognize if that card is a foreign card or not and provide the DCC choice on the screen. So in an in-store environment, multi-currency pricing will work, but we haven't really seen that adopted as widely as dynamic currency conversion would be in store. In an e-commerce environment, multi-currency pricing is a very interesting concept for merchants because what it does compared to DCC is it offers the cardholder the choice to see the prices in their currency very early on in that shopping process. So whether it uses GOIP or whether it gives you a drop-down menu, you get to choose as a cardholder what that browsing journey is going to be currency-wise. And when you get to the checkout, you already know what that amount is going to be. Again, there is some upkeep required from a merchant point of view, but yeah, MCP in an e-commerce environment is definitely a compelling proposition for merchants because what it gives those cardholders is that visibility of what the items that they're purchasing in their currency cost very early on. The difference with dynamic currency conversion is you're going to be shopping in that merchant's currency until you get to the checkout, and only when you input your card details will you see what that amount will cost you in your home currency, so to speak. So MCP, in summary, instantaneous visibility of what the pricing is in your currency. Dynamic currency conversion, at the checkout, you'll get to see what that pricing is. And what I would highly recommend merchants do is if they're unsure as to whether MCP or DCC is something that works for them, contact us in Consulting Services in Merlin and we'll be happy to talk to you about the e-commerce business that you're running. We'll have a look at some of your data. We'll see where your cardholders are coming from, and we'll tell you whether MCP or DCC is a more viable option for you.
That's really clear and also really interesting to understand better. Thank you, Hugh. So yeah, in a moment, I'd like to finish off with this topic of which merchants it's relevant for and maybe some more about the feedback you've had from them. But before we come on to that, I do just want to remind people that if they would like to get in touch with us, make suggestions for topics you'd like to cover, or give us any other feedback, then you can reach us by emailing ndp-podcast@worldline.com. And of course, my usual gentle reminder that if you haven't already, please take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. So Hugh, in terms of the merchants that this is interesting for, are there particular segments or types of merchant that this is really beneficial for?
So again, I'm going to go back to our Eurovision example, and you and I are getting ourselves prepared for Basel on May the 17th. And I mean, if we talk through that customer journey for you and I, what we'll probably need to do is book a hotel. We'll probably need to book a taxi that will take us from the airport in Basel to our hotel. We'll be buying non-alcoholic beer, I'm sure, in Basel over the course of the few days that we're there to celebrate the Eurovision. So really, in a sense, when you think about where DCC works and works well, it's hospitality and travel. When we look at hospitality and travel, we're talking about hotels, we're talking about resorts, airlines, car rental agencies, all of that ecosystem around hospitality and travel where cardholders can interact and pay is a very compelling proposition for dynamic currency conversion. Retail, in particular, in tourist areas. So again, going back to the example of you and I drowning our sorrows and buying a Rolex in Basel after the Eurovision. Luxury retail, grocery retail, restaurants. You and I will be eating out, I'm sure, when we're in Basel, David. So again, you with your British card, me with my Swedish kroner card, it'll be great for us to know at the end of the meal what that is going to cost us in our home currencies. And last and certainly not least, as I've mentioned earlier, e-commerce environments are really, really good places for dynamic currency conversion as well. Again, that shopping experience of the cardholder maybe purchasing online in Swiss franc. So again, we're probably booking our hotel and we want to pay up front. The prices are in Swiss franc and we're thinking, is this hotel expensive or is it not expensive? When we get to the checkout, we input our card details and we get that currency conversion option. You and I will have that peace of mind of knowing that, yes, this hotel is not expensive, or most likely, David, it is very expensive, but we're going to stay anyway because we are going to treat ourselves while we're in Basel for the Eurovision. So really, where you think DCC, think foreign cardholders, tourists. But what I would say is anywhere where card payments are accepted, that's a good place for DCC.
Which is almost everywhere these days.
Which is almost everywhere. And I can give a very good example. My brother opened a business recently back in Ireland, a driving range. The Ryder Cup is going to be on in Ireland in 2027. We're going to have a huge influx of foreign visitors. So DCC, I think in Ireland in 2027 will be a critical component of all of those travellers coming from the US in particular, but other European countries that don't have euro, which is what we use in Ireland. They'll get that visibility of dynamic currency conversion at the point of sale. And at that point of sale, I think about my brother and his driving range. You can pay online and book your bay. You can pay in store and book your bay. When you go to the vending machine and you want to get a bucket of golf balls, you can pay with your card at the vending machine. All of those points of interaction can be activated for DCC. So I think that's the compelling proposition here. It doesn't matter really where you're paying. DCC can be achieved no matter where.
And I don't know if this is like my own personal bias, but I guess instinctively I think of tourism when I think of DCC and travel. But of course, there's lots of travel that isn't tourism, business travel, and also lots of locations that people might pass through. And what I have in mind is in London, say, there are several railway stations with lots of shops there, but they are connected to some of the airports around London. And so you actually get quite a large throughput of international travellers, even though the railway station itself is not a tourist destination, I wouldn't say. And we probably in the UK wouldn't even think of it as a particularly an international destination, but actually you still get a lot of international people passing through who will then want to buy things from the stores there. So I guess it is, as you say, it's potentially anywhere that is accepting card payments and probably a broader set of shops than we might initially think that could benefit from it. So maybe a last point, which I think you've perhaps hinted at, but we've not addressed head on, is from the merchant perspective. We've talked a lot about the benefits for consumers and why they would find this attractive. But what feedback have you had from merchants about the value they see or otherwise in offering this to their customers?
Probably a good question to finish up on, David. So what our merchants tell us first and foremost is that they see improved customer satisfaction and loyalty when they offer DCC. And again, this is where merchants haven't had DCC previously, have it now, and can make that comparison. What they see as well is fewer disputes and chargebacks, because people are fully aware of what that transaction amount is going to be at that point of purchase. When they choose DCC, they know already what they've committed to, and that's what they see in their account. DCC as a service for merchants as well, David, it's not that difficult to actually implement and integrate into their existing systems. And again, this is where I think any merchants listening who have an interest in dynamic currency conversion and potentially implementing it, contact us at Worldline. We'll have a look at your existing infrastructure and let you know what will be required to activate DCC. That's both in store and in e-commerce. And fourth, and I mean, I'd be remiss not to mention this point as well, the fee structure is important with DCC. So rather than the issuing bank charging that fee and getting that 1 to 3 to 5% on the FX fee, we're giving some of that back to the merchant. So DCC actually has a tangible impact on that merchant's bottom line, typically by reducing their transaction costs. So again, a key benefit for merchants is that this is a value-added service that can actually have a bottom line impact for merchants too as well. So I think all in all, definitely something that merchants should actively look at.
So that's really interesting. So on the one hand, there is a kind of a cost benefit for the merchant in terms of processing transactions, but also, and maybe more important actually, there is this convenience they're providing to the consumer, but also, I guess, from a brand perspective, I'm thinking about disputes and chargebacks. And ultimately, you know, if you get debited more from your bank account than you were expecting, it may not be the merchant's fault, but I think many people, you know, their experience was with the merchant, and they will potentially hold that against the merchant, even if it's nothing to do with the merchant, how much they in the end got charged and what the FX rate was from their bank. So I guess in terms of a customer experience, but also a brand perception, it can be really good to provide that transparency and certainty to their customers.
I think you're right, David. And I actually spoke at the beginning of the podcast to an example I was going to use. And again, I hope I'm not flogging a dead horse here with the Eurovision, but again, it's an example of you and I in Basel, and this idea that we're going to both treat ourselves to a Rolex after the poor showing at the Eurovision. So what I did was I looked at the exchange rate today between British pound and Swiss franc, which is what you're going to be transacting in. And I also looked at the exchange rate between euro and Swiss franc, which is hypothetically what I'm going to be transacting in. So British pound to Swiss franc, you're getting 1.14 Swiss francs for your British pound. Okay. Psychologically, for me, what I would do there is I would just round down to 1, and I'd say, you know what? When I'm in Switzerland, everything is 1 for 1. Me as the Euro card holder, I'm getting 0.95 Swiss francs for my €1. Again, psychologically, and because I'm lazy, I would probably just round up and say, you know what? It's close to 1. I'm getting 1 for 1. So if something costs 100 francs, I'm saying that it costs €100. Now we buy our luxury watch. Our merchant thankfully has DCC activated, and we're spending 40,000 Swiss francs on these watches, David, by the way. So just be prepared. Now, if we were to use the 1-to-1 conversion that we already psychologically prepared ourselves for before traveling to Switzerland, what we're saying is that Rolex is going to cost you £40,000 and it's going to cost me €40,000. The reality is that Rolex for you is going to cost 35,000, give or take, and for me 42,000. So having that currency conversion option presented all of a sudden creates a very different checkout dynamic for you and I. I might all of a sudden think I was only willing to spend 40, 42 is too much. So as a traveler, at least I can make a conscious choice to say, not buying it, it's too expensive. You all of a sudden psychologically may be saying, that's 5,000 less than I had planned for. This is fantastic. I'll take 2, please. So this is what DCC does. It levels the playing field for those cardholders when they're overseas. And that's why I think I can probably speak so passionately about it.
It feels like I'm going to have to start saving up for my trip to Eurovision.
You are. You definitely are.
I don't know if the idea.
Plans, David.
I don't know if the idea of this is comfort shopping for if we lose, in which case I perhaps have a renewed interest in the UK doing well this time.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I think that's a really nice example actually to finish on, and I think it just highlights how important it is to give consumers confidence in a transaction. And then we always talk about that almost in any aspect of payments, that at the end of the day, it's about trust. It's funny to think we've spent so long talking about DCC, which is quite a niche in payments, but it's so often the case, I think, that any payments topic, once you start scratching the surface, there's a lot of detail behind, a lot of interesting things on the technical side of how it works, but also just the psychology of it and the impact it has for consumers and for businesses. So really want to thank you, Hugh, for coming on and sharing your expertise on the subject. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure to participate, and I look forward to the further episodes of Navigating Digital Payments, which, like I said, really enjoying. So keep up the good work.
As I say, real pleasure to have you on board. So thanks again. And that just leaves me, of course, last but not least, to thank our dear listeners for joining us once again as we navigated digital payments.
Thank you for listening to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline. Join us next time to learn more about the latest innovations, trends, and predictions for the future of payments.